This company was once the largest business corporation on earth, bigger than any bank, bigger than any industrial trust in America. It employed nearly 280,000 people. It moved more freight and more passengers than any railroad in history. Presidents rode it. Wall Street worshipped it. Then it merged with the one rival it had spent a century trying to beat. Less than 2 years later, it collapsed. The largest bankruptcy in American history at that point. Everyone blames the merger. That's not wrong. It's just too small. The real trap was built decades earlier, hidden away. That explanation is not completely wrong. It is just too small. Mergers fail all the time without producing the largest bankruptcy in American history. Something else was already broken, and it had been broken for a very long time before anyone in Washington or on Wall Street noticed. To understand what actually happened, you have to go back to 1846 to a much smaller and much more desperate company. Philadelphia was losing. The Erie Canal had opened 2 decades earlier and was pulling Western trade toward New York. Baltimore had its own railroad pushing west too, and if it got there first, Philadelphia's economy would be finished. So, the Pennsylvania legislature chartered a railroad on April 13th, 1846, with one job: get from Harrisburg to Pittsburgh before somebody else claimed that route for good. This was not a company built on ambition, it was built on fear. A chief engineer named John Edgar Thompson found a path through the Alleghenies that no one thought was possible, curving trains up and around the mountains instead of blasting straight through them. The result, opened in 1854, was Horseshoe Curve, a piece of track so clever it cut the trip from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh from about 4 days down to roughly 15 hours. That single curve is the reason this company existed at all. Everyone thinks this is a story about a railroad. It isn't. Not really. It is a story about what happens when a company becomes so good at being permanent that it forgets how to change. In the 1850s, moving goods and people across Pennsylvania meant a miserable hybrid of canals, inclined planes, and slow connecting trains. It froze in winter. It required multiple transfers. It was the kind of system that made people accept delay as normal. The Pennsylvania Railroad's promise was simple: one company, one route, no transfers, no ice. That is why it felt shocking at the time. It wasn't glamorous, it was reliable, and reliable was revolutionary. And it worked. By 1857, the company had bought out the state's clumsy canal and incline system outright. By 1871, it reached New York Harbor. Between 1881 and 1901, historians consider it the largest business corporation on the planet. Not the largest railroad, the largest company of any kind. It kept building. It tunneled under the Hudson River and opened Pennsylvania Station in Manhattan in 1910, an underground cathedral that cost more than $100 million. It launched the Broadway Limited in 1912, an 18-hour dash between New York and Chicago that turned train travel into theater. By 1916, it was calling itself the standard railroad of the world, and almost nobody argued with the name. Employment tells you what this company actually was. At its peak around 1919 and 1920, it employed close to 280,000 people, more than double the size of the entire United States Army at the time. This was not a business. It was closer to a small nation with tracks instead of borders. A 1936 issue of Forbes told its readers not to think of the Pennsylvania Railroad as a company at all, but as a nation. That is not exaggeration for effect. That is how contemporaries actually understood its scale. Through the 1920s and into the 1930s, the company kept spending like it believed its own myth. It electrified its busiest main lines between New York, Washington, Philadelphia, and Harrisburg, over 2,000 miles of overhead wire, the most heavily electrified railroad on Earth. It opened Philadelphia's 30th Street Station in 1933, another marble monument built on the assumption that the good times were structural, not temporary. During the Second World War, it moved more than 17 million military personnel, running tens of thousands of extra troop trains. For over 100 consecutive years, it paid its shareholders a dividend without missing one. That streak was practically sacred on Wall Street. It was proof or so everyone thought, that this company could not fail. Here's the part where the story usually stops, because this is where the myth is loudest. But this is also exactly where the trap was already closing. While the Pennsylvania Railroad was busy being permanent, its oldest rival was quietly finding an advantage it could never match. The New York Central ran along the flat banks of the Hudson River and Lake Erie, the so-called water level route, while the Pennsylvania Railroad had to drag every train over the Alleghenies, burning more fuel and more time to cover the same distance. For decades, the two railroads behaved almost like a cartel, avoiding real price wars because ruining each other would have ruined them both. That truce could not last forever. Other threats were building too. The Pennsylvania Railroad had owned roughly a third of the Norfolk and Western for decades, treating it as a quiet, profitable investment. But by 1964, the Norfolk and Western had absorbed the Nickel Plate and the Wabash and grown into a leaner, stronger competitor. A company the Pennsylvania Railroad used to control was now outgrowing it. That same year, the Chesapeake and Ohio absorbed the Baltimore and Ohio. Every major Eastern railroad was consolidating, bracing for something. And outside the railroad industry entirely, a bigger threat was already arriving. The Interstate Highway Act of 1956 built the very roads that let trucking companies steal the flexible, high-value freight without ever having to build or maintain a mile of track. Airlines, heavily subsidized, pulled away long-distance passengers who used to ride named trains as a matter of course. The railroad had built an empire on owning everything it needed. Its competitors were building empires on owning almost nothing at all. This is where people get the timeline wrong. Most accounts of this collapse start the clock in 1968 with the merger. The real beginning was 1946, and almost nobody noticed it happen. In 1946, the Pennsylvania Railroad posted its first net loss in company history. It had survived the entire Great Depression without a single unprofitable year. Then, right after winning a world war, it lost money for the first time. The dividends still went out. The named trains still ran. 30th Street Station still gleamed. From the outside, nothing looked different. But the company that called itself the Standard Railroad of the world had quietly stopped being profitable, 24 years before anyone would call it dead. What was actually happening underneath the marble was simple and brutal. The Pennsylvania Railroad had built itself for a 19th century industrial economy: coal, steel, heavy freight, dense population corridors, and it owned every inch of infrastructure that economy required. Multiple parallel tracks, redundant stations, enormous yards built for a volume of traffic that was already starting to shrink. All of that had to be maintained and taxed, whether a single train used it or not. That is the part people miss about owning your own network. It gives you total control, and it hands you a bill you cannot put down, even when demand disappears. Government regulation made the trap worse, not better. The Interstate Commerce Commission controlled railroad rates and could block a railroad from abandoning a money-losing route, even one that had been bleeding cash for years. A private company was legally forbidden from doing the one thing that might have saved it, shutting down the parts of itself that no longer made sense. By the 1960s, the company's passenger service alone was losing over $100 million a year, and there was no clean legal path to walk away from it. That sounds like a footnote. It was actually the mechanism of the entire collapse. Add labor rules that preserved jobs no longer required by modern equipment. Add a shift from coal to oil that gutted a freight market the railroad had depended on for a century. Add trucks and airplanes taking the profitable traffic while leaving the fixed costs behind. None of these things, on their own, would have killed a company this size. Together, they meant the Pennsylvania Railroad was already structurally exhausted before it ever agreed to merge with anyone. And that is exactly the condition in which two exhausted rivals decided to become one company. Stockholders approved a merger with the New York Central in 1962. In that same year, President Kennedy personally urged the country's railroads to merge, warning that the national rail network was buckling under problems no single company could fix alone. That message gave the merger political cover. It did not give it a working plan. The Interstate Commerce Commission did not sign off until 1966, after years of hearings. On February 1st, 1968, the merger finally took effect, creating Penn Central, on paper the sixth largest corporation in the country, controlling more than 20,000 miles of track from St. Louis and Chicago to Boston and Montreal. It should have been a rescue. Instead, it became a demolition because the two companies that merged had spent 100 years actively competing with each other, and nobody had actually solved that rivalry. They had just signed paperwork over it. The Pennsylvania Railroad's management culture was conservative and hierarchical. The New York Central's management under Alfred Perlman was younger and leaner. Chairman Stuart Saunders ran the combined company from Philadelphia. President Perlman ran operations from New York. They rarely spoke, and when they did, according to the people who covered the collapse afterward, it did not go well. Two proud bureaucracies were now sharing one org chart, and neither one had actually surrendered. Then came the detail that sounds almost unbelievable, except it's fully documented. The two railroads' computer systems could not talk to each other. Freight cars entered the merged network and simply vanished from view, misrouted, unaccounted for, sitting on sidings while shippers called, asking where their goods had gone. A system built to move a nation's freight could no longer reliably tell you where that freight actually was. As if that weren't enough, regulators required the new company to absorb the bankrupt New York, New Haven, and Hartford Railroad at the end of 1968 as a condition of approving the merger. Penn Central didn't get to choose its problems. It was handed someone else's failing railroad on top of its own. The public saw a merger announcement and assumed stability. The people inside the company were watching something closer to a slow-motion collision. And here's the detail that still bothers people who've studied this. The company kept paying its dividend anyway. When the Securities and Exchange Commission finally investigated, in a report released in 1972, it produced more than 25,000 pages of testimony. It detailed an investment club tied to the company's own chief financial officer, several $1 million quietly diverted to interest in Liechtenstein, and an executive jet subsidiary that had lost more than $31 million by 1969. None of this saved a single job. It just explained, in exhaustive detail, how confident the company had looked while it was already failing. The books were being managed to look survivable. The railroad underneath them was not. By 1969, the company had already lost close to $83 million. That is the kind of number that should have triggered alarms across the entire industry, and in a sense, it did, quietly. In June of 1970, the federal government considered guaranteeing a loan to keep the company afloat, and then backed away, concluding the losses were not a temporary problem, but a structural one. Without that guarantee, and without a private rescue that also fell apart, there was nothing left to do. On June 21st, 1970, Penn Central filed for bankruptcy. At the time, it was the largest corporate bankruptcy in American history. It had roughly $4.6 billion in assets on paper, still employed more than 100,000 people, and controlled about 1/8 of all freight moved by rail in the United States. This wasn't a regional carrier stumbling. It was one of the 6 largest corporations in the country, coming apart in public. The company's 1970 results would eventually show a net loss of $325 million, a company hemorrhaging value in real time, not absorbing a bad quarter. The shock did not stay contained to one railroad. Within weeks, the Federal Reserve saw emergency borrowing at its discount window jump from roughly $660 million to nearly $1.7 billion, and it had to step in to prop up the entire commercial paper market for the first time since 1933. One railroad's failure had come close to cracking part of the American financial system. What followed was not one dramatic ending. It was a long series of smaller ones. Freight theft and vandalism on the crumbling network topped $5.5 million in just 10 months of 1970 alone. Proof the collapse wasn't only happening in courtrooms, it was happening on the tracks, in the yards, in broad daylight. In 1972, some of the company's own history was auctioned off inside 30th Street Station. Memorabilia and archives from an empire that once called itself a nation sold for just over $114,000, a fraction of what anyone expected. The building itself stayed magnificent. What used to be inside it did not. 4 separate investigations followed in total. The Securities and Exchange Commission, the Interstate Commerce Commission, a federal grand jury, and Congress itself, all trying to explain how a company this large could fall this fast. Bankruptcy protection is not the same thing as the end. It's an attempt to survive. What actually ended the Pennsylvania Railroad as a functioning system came later, in pieces. In 1971, the passenger business, the named trains, the glamorous part of the identity, was handed off entirely to the newly created Amtrak. In 1976, after courts concluded Penn Central could not reorganize itself, the federal government did something it had never done before. It nationalized the freight network, folding Penn Central and 6 other failed railroads into a new government-created company called Conrail. The empire that once called itself the standard railroad of the world now existed because the United States government had decided it had to. The rescue was not cheap. It took years of losses before Conrail turned its first profit in 1981. After the Staggers Rail Act of 1980 finally let railroads set their own rates and abandon routes that made no sense. The exact freedom regulators had denied the Pennsylvania Railroad a decade earlier, granted just in time to save what was left of it. In 1999, 2 other railroads, CSX and Norfolk Southern, bought Conrail and split it between them, quietly undoing more than 30 years later the very merger that had destroyed the Pennsylvania Railroad in the first place. Notice what actually happened here. The company did not simply vanish overnight. Its passenger identity was stripped away first. Its freight network was taken over by the state, then handed back to competitors. What remained of Penn Central as a corporation kept existing on paper, holding real estate and pipelines and insurance interests, eventually renaming itself into a financial holding company that had nothing to do with running trains. The brand technically survived. The railroad did not. None of this happened to a spreadsheet. It happened to people who had built their entire lives around a schedule. Altoona, Pennsylvania, existed largely because the Pennsylvania Railroad built it as a company town in 1849 to house the workers who built and repaired its locomotives. At its peak, close to 19,000 people worked in those shops. When diesel replaced steam and when the parent company started collapsing under its own weight, those jobs did not come back. A city that had organized itself entirely around one employer's fortunes had no backup plan when that employer stopped being fortunate. The 1968 merger had come with promises of lifetime job protection for thousands of employees, a condition regulators insisted on to win union support. 2 years later, those promises were worth exactly as much as a paycheck from a company that couldn't pay its bills. In Philadelphia, commuters who depended on the railroad for basic movement into the city watched service decay in real time, trains running late, breaking down, disappearing from timetables, and their frustration became public enough that it helped elect a governor in 1970 who ran partly against the railroad's failures. Businesses that shipped freight through the network found their shipments simply gone, swallowed by 2 computer systems that couldn't agree on where anything was, sometimes for over a year. A missed shipment doesn't sound dramatic until you remember it might have been someone's payroll, someone's inventory, someone's ability to keep their own business running. This is the part that gets lost when we talk about the largest bankruptcy in American history, like it's a trivia fact. Every one of those dollars represented a real disruption to someone who had no vote in the merger, no seat at the negotiating table, and no say in whether 2 proud, exhausted companies could actually work together. So, what does a collapse like this actually prove? Not that big companies are somehow doomed, not that this was simple bad luck. It proves something more specific and more uncomfortable. A company can be regulated so tightly that it isn't allowed to shrink, even when shrinking is the only path to survival. It proves that owning everything you need can look like strength for decades, right up until the moment demand changes and you're the one left holding a bill nobody else has to pay. It proves that 100 consecutive years of dividends can coexist quietly with a company that has already stopped being healthy. And it proves that when a system this large finally does fail, it isn't the executives who lose the most. It's the shop worker in Altoona, the commuter in Philadelphia, and the small business waiting on a freight car that nobody can find. If you ever rode the Broadway Limited or had family who worked those Altoona shops, or remember when Penn Central's name started showing up in the news for all the wrong reasons, say so in the comments. For a company this size, there's no museum built to hold every memory of what it actually meant to the people who depended on it. The comments section might be the closest thing to an archive that's left. Horseshoe Curve is still there. Trains still climb it every single day. The same grade John Edgar Thompson carved out of the mountain in 1854 to save a company that no longer exists. The locomotives still round the bend exactly the way they always have. They just don't say Pennsylvania Railroad on the side anymore.